Well, welcome to Bainbridge Island. Wish we could be all out on the beach together. As usually on a SCAT class, you want to spend a good chunk of time out there, walking the beach and going through a lot of the things that we talked about in the class in the field. But we're just going to take you for a walk on a beach that's very close to our office and highlight some of the things that we talked about today.
Now this is actually it's a sheltered beach. It's in a place called Eagle Harbour, and it's a great spot. It's got a variety of things associated with both the character of the shoreline, both the intertidal zone and the different backshore types, and it's also got quite a range of sediments here. And so it's a pretty good teaching beach, and we're just going to take you through some of the major elements, so you can get an appreciation of what are the things that we look for when we're going along a shoreline such as this.
I want to take a moment to go over some of the concepts we talked about, and this one in particular is about segmentation. We're looking at the shoreline here, but as we look along the shoreline, you're going to see a lot of different materials forming the shoreline. You have the big riprap boulder you can see up here where Ed is standing, and Ed's standing up at the high water line up there. That's a high tide line. You can see we have a sand beach with a cover of cobble and pebble. We go back into riprap as we look over to the north here, and then we go into sort of a low bank, again, sand and cobble, pebble, long stretch with that high tide strand line of logs at the back shore. And then as we continue to span around, you can see riprap down there. You can see with the intertidal sand cobble beach. You've got a backshore man-made wooden material breaking the high water line back into riprap and so forth. So when we're thinking about the shoreline and oil coming on the shoreline, we want to understand that we need to keep these in chunks, in different segments and different pieces, because we're looking for a consistency in the slope of the shoreline, the material of the shoreline, and we're looking for features in the backshore that are going to be important to operations. And we would have this information ideally already mapped out, so we can think about segments and characterizing the oil conditions in each of those segments. That becomes important for operations. It steers them to the right place. Each one of these segments will have a start and end point, usually marked with a GPS, and ideally already loaded into your GPS, so you can find the start and end of segments when you're in the field. But the key things is look at changes in the shoreline shape, material on the shoreline, and then the features of the backshore. If we scan down to the far end down here, you can see a very high slope at the backshore. That's going to make it very difficult for operations to work. As we move over to this way, we have homes and people living right on the shoreline in this area. As we move around this way, you can see we have more of a natural backshore, more homes, and then an extensive area of a low relief backshore. All those have implications for the people that are going to be working on the beach, how they're going to get to the beach, and of course sensitivities. To what degree is this beach used, and how much oil has to be cleaned off of this beach given the use that it has.
Once we've decided the location of the alongshore segments, then we need to look at the across-shore component. And in this segment here, which is just a little beach, as you can see, there's a gradation. The logs that are sitting right at the high water mark and above the high water mark form that one substrate type. Behind that, it's just a little grassy scrub area. And then you go down the beach. We call this part down to about here. This is a beach face slope. It's a steeper part of the beach. And what's interesting is that, as you can see, it's wet. And so the groundwater that forms the back shore is actually seeping out through the beach. This is actually fresh water. Well, it's a bit salty because it gets mixed in with the tide, high tide, of course. Gets mixed in with the seawater, but it's draining out of the beach. And so when we look at the character of the sediments, we have pebbles and cobbles and this water-saturated sand-mud mix, which extends out, see the whole width of the low tide terrace, which is the next component. This is flat area. So we've got two major components, a beach face slope, which is really the upper half of the intertidal zone in elevation, and then the low tide terrace, which is the lower half, which is much wider and flatter. We can see there's a mixture here of ridges, which are pebble cobble, and there's actually a sand ridge over there as well. The sediments control the behavior of the oil. So if we look over here, the back shore is riprap. Basically they're big boulders, but they've got tremendous amount of space in here. And the high tide line was marked by these, you can see the barnacle line. So at high tide, the water level's here. And any oil that's heading towards shore, when that tide is up, that oil's likely going to penetrate with the water. It'll penetrate right in between all of these large spaces. And it gets a bit stuck in there. And so when the tide goes out, some of that oil, residual oil, is going to be left right inside this riprap structure. It's basically a boulder beach in real terms. And we'll talk about size in a moment. So this is always a real problem because that oil that's trapped inside these boulder ripraps can actually leach out on the next high tide and be remobilized. Just as a little aside, one of the things that we do when we're describing the alongshore and the across shore components is we need to actually describe the size of the sediments. And I said they're mixed, so we've got everything from boulder size right the way down to silts and muds, but we need to sort of characterize them. When we're filling out a form, we need to actually be a bit more specific. So sand is up to about a couple of millimeters, and granules, well, they're up to 4. So we use a photo scale. And 4 to 64 is a pebble. Well, one way of sort of measuring a pebble, I thought I had one here, it's about the size of a tennis ball. So if we put a tennis ball down, we can use that even in your imagination as a way to very grossly or generalize the sediment size. And 64 to 200 and whatever it is about the size of a soccer ball. There, how's that? And so we can use these generalizations to characterize. So anything bigger than a soccer ball is a boulder. So all of those are boulders. There's 1 or 2 boulders here, but not very many. It's mainly in the pebble range and smaller than that into the granules and the sands. This is just an example a little bit further down the beach of a well-sorted surface layer of large pebbles and cobbles, and underneath this is a much finer substrate which prevents the penetration of oil down into the subsurface. This is a pretty sheltered location, but if you look out down towards the south and the southeast, there's actually a pretty long fetch, you know, the area over which the wind can blow. And so we can get a few storm waves in here. And one of the pieces of evidence that there is wave action moving the sediments, right down here, there's a ridge, a little ridge. And I put the scale there just to show the leading edge of that ridge. This is a ridge that's actually migrating up the beach, slowly, but during each tide there's sufficient wave action to move those sands, those granules and those pebbles. There's sufficient wave action to move that sediment up higher onto the upper part of the intertidal zone.
Just want to take a moment to go through some of the things that you'll need when you're out here in the field. And first and foremost, you got to be thinking about safety and what you're wearing. Understand that conditions can change while you're out surveying during the course of a day, It may be beautiful and look sunny in the morning and turn into a rainy, wet day. So you want to be prepared with the right equipment and your right personal protective equipment. Almost always carry a backpack, and you have some just emergency rations, water, and then your backup equipment there. Amongst other things too, it really helps for the team to be clearly visible. So high-vis vests, something like that makes you stand out. It's easy to find people. What are some of the other things that you're going to need? Well, you're going to need your GPS and your camera. These are two basic, really key ingredients here. One, your GPS is logging. It's continuously recording where you are. So you usually will set this to log on a specific time sequence. So if you're walking, you can set it to record the GPS signal at maybe every 5 seconds. Plenty. You're not going to cover much ground in 5 seconds. If, however, you're flying in a helicopter and you're doing your SCAT work in a helicopter, you may want to shorten that up to every second because you're moving along quickly along the shoreline. So you want to have your GPS, and then of course you're going to use that to waypoint any features. We talked about segment boundaries. We are in a segment right here, but we would mark the beginning of the segment, and then as we go down the beach, you can see this segment will continue following the marsh in the back shore till we can come up to the end where we see some riprap, and then you see those logs that are forming the back shore. So that would be a segment boundary. We would waypoint that location as well. And then your camera. This is going to be taking the evidence and the photographs of along the shoreline. You want to get a good shot along the shoreline, a shot across the shoreline, and of course photos that are very demonstrative of the oil conditions that you see, the oil zones, and of the pits that you might do. Think about operations. If there's a good point of access, you want to waypoint that and then even include a photograph if it's going to be a place where operations might want to stage equipment or make it easier for them to find those locations. One of the things to do is to sync these two. Make sure your GPS and your camera are synced. And the easiest way to do that is to take a photograph of the time stamp on your GPS. So turn the menu on your GPS to the page where you see the time to seconds. Take a photograph of that. Then you can always synchronize your GPS positions with your pictures. Of course, in the field, you're going to need as well your field notebook, your notes. This is what I always use for documenting oil conditions. There's certainly a number of apps that have been developed that you can use on mobile phones or on field devices that you can take out and record the information, document the information of oiling conditions on the shoreline in either one. I find it easier to make my notes, and then I can transfer those or have somebody entering that information. If I have a field unit, somebody can enter that information alongside with me. Gloves, if you're going to be touching or handling anything that's oily, you don't want to put your hands in it, so you want to make sure you have gloves. Eyewear is recommended when you're doing pits in particular. If you're doing pits, you'll need the shovel. Or better yet, one of your assistants will need the shovel. And but that's where it's recommended that you have eyewear just in case you're striking rock with metal, things like that. But those are your essential tools of the trade in the field. And your eyesight, yours and your whole team. Remember, there's a team of you out here. So you want to distribute your team across the beach. You want to have everybody keep their eyes open. Anybody that sees something of note should bring that to the attention of the SCAT team lead. Get that documented. We're all working together, and the more eyes that are looking and keeping aware of where oil may be stranded or features that you see on the shoreline of interest to operations, make sure you get that recorded.
So in this next segment, one of the key features is the fact that we've got a small stream that's coming out, as we'll see in a moment, from the back shore. There's actually a marsh in the back shore in this segment, and this is draining from the back shore across the beach. Now, of course, it's low tide right now, and as with the riprap, you also have to imagine what this is going to look like at high tide, because high tide is the log line up in here, the drift line if you want. And so at high tide, again, any oil that's heading onshore and going to be stranded at the high tide, on a spring tide when the water levels are just a little bit above the average high tides, that oil could actually penetrate into the marsh up this stream, because there'll be a flow of the tidal waters that'll go into the back shore area. So this is a very vulnerable location. This is an area we need to pay attention to when we're doing our sketches and our description. We want to identify this as a potential entry pathway for oil to go into that back shore area. So we've moved along the beach to another segment now. This is a back shore marsh. The location's called Hawley Cove, and it's a very, a day like today, beautiful day. Our offices are only half a mile up the road, or about 3/4 of a kilometre. So, in these COVID restricted days when you want to go out for a little stretch, it's a nice walk to come down here at low tide. But anyway, the marsh, just to talk about where we are, this is in the dieback, the senescence stage in the middle of the winter. But we can see the zones here. Importantly, we can see the logs. So I talked a little bit a while ago about the oil getting up into the marsh. Well, the logs have got up here during high tides or a storm surge, not big storm waves, but the water level has certainly been sufficiently high to carry these logs over the little berm into this backshore area. The zonation that we see here, we've got a lot of grasses, some cattails, some bulrushes, more grassy in the middle, and then there's a darker fringe of shrubs which mark that transition from the marine saltwater environment into the freshwater terrestrial vegetation that's at the back, and then the line of trees, of course. It looks pretty sort of quiet in here, but it's not the surface, it's not the grasses or the bulrushes that you can see here that are important. That's not a ship running aground, that's actually the ferry. We live on an island, and that's how we get off the island. What's important here is not what you actually see, which is right now a lot of dead stems and grasses and bulrushes. What's really important is what's in the soil, what's in the ground here. This is amazingly productive. I mean, probably 95% of the biomass, the living part of this marsh, is below the surface, whether it's little crabs, nematodes, all sorts of Latin named creepy crawlies and things like that. They live in there all the time, and there's shellfish. The birds like it here because they feed off those as well. Now in the summer, what you see is those same animals, those worms, nematodes, clams, there's even little mice, probably some raccoons and other things in here. This is a vibrant place, and you can see when the grass grows just how lush it is and how productive this environment is. So should the oil get into this marsh, and it can either creep in through that little stream that we saw further back down there, or it can come over the top if the water levels are very high, it is likely to oil the vegetation. Because these soils are water saturated, the potential for oil to get into the subsurface biomass is pretty low. So if we see the surface covered in oil, those grasses will probably survive pretty well, because it's the root systems that we're concerned about. That also leads into an operational consideration. In trying to remove the oil, we need to be extremely careful that we don't trample oil and push it into the sediments, where it then can have a greater impact on that subsurface biomass. So we can go in here, put down boardwalks and cut the vegetation. It won't do it any harm in the long term. and that will grow back during the next spring-summer growth period.
All right, well, we've been walking along this segment, and I can see oil over here in the upper intertidal zone. And that's usually where we're going to find that oil stranded, is working its way into the upper intertidal zone. It may get deposited into the lower or mid intertidal, but on the rising tide, a lot of that is going to get lifted off and deposited up on the upper intertidal. And if we're unfortunate enough to have spring tides with wave events, it could make its way into the backshore and into the marsh there. But let's go down here and do some documentation on this surface oil. We're fortunate that we don't have a lot of oil on the beach here. But having walked the segment, we did find our zone of oiling. Remember, we're going to find surface oiling. We're going to divide it into zones. We may have one zone in the upper intertidal here, maybe another oiled zone in the mid intertidal. We could have two distinct zones of oiling broken up by an area of no oiling in between. So when we think of that surface oiling, we're thinking of zones. And we're going to use this log that you can see here. You can see this wood. You can see the wood over here, a little further down the beach. This is our oiled zone, and it is in the upper intertidal zone. So what do we want to describe? We want to describe the length of the oiled zone, the width, where it's located, and the percent distribution of oil that we see in that zone. Now, one of the challenges is, if you have something like this, do you want to call it two zones, one zone? Really, given the extent of the beach here, I would just characterize this as a single zone. And so you would have your GPS to mark your start of the oiled zone. You're going to mark it with a waypoint, start, and then you can walk the length of the oiled zone, come to the end of your oiled zone, and mark it with the GPS. And now you've got it clearly identified. So when this goes back to the data manager and they download the GPSs, they'll actually have a start and end point. Of course, that's part of the documentation. So you have your waypoints, start and end of your oiled zone. You also want to make sure that you get the camera out and document what you have for that oil zone. And this is where you want to make sure you've got a good scale. So a scale can be your notebook, or it can be a person, it can be a shovel. But you want to get a photograph along the shoreline of your oil zone. And then if your oil has a particular characteristic, that heavy oil, a thick oil, in this case it's thick, it's more than a centimeter, so we're going to actually measure how thick it is, and we can document up close that character. Operations now understands exactly what they're going to be working with. How thick is it? Again, that's one of the advantages of having your field notebook out here. You measure it and then document what that thickness is. The other thing we want to do is measure or give it some percent distribution. Is it continuous? Do we just see continued oil right through here, or do we see a broken or some non-continuous oil? One of the things that's really helpful, and you saw this during the class, is to again use your oil distribution cheat sheet so that you can look along the shoreline and say, okay, this is something that's probably on the order of about between 10 to 20%. Okay, you can give it a 15%. That's what we record. We don't record the patching. We don't record broken. We actually record the percent. And then we've got our oiled zone defined. Length, width, distribution, and character of the oil in that patch or in that zone. One of the things that we need to do is make sure that we've not just looked at the oil that's on the surface, but we've looked to see what we might have in the subsurface. And a question will be, where do you want your pits? If you saw no oil, do you do a pit? I usually will have at least a few pits, again, aimed at the upper intertidal, even though I may not see any oil, just to confirm that there's nothing there. But if I have an oiled zone, then I most definitely want to have a pit in the oiled zone to characterize if that oil has penetrated into the subsurface or if it's been buried. As was pointed out a little bit in the other segment, if you have a fine grain material, that oil may not penetrate very much if it has any viscosity at all. A light oil can penetrate easily, even into a fine grained sand. So we're going to dig a pit in this zone. This is usually where you have your assistant working to dig that up. And digging in this mixed sand, pebble, cobble is not too bad. If you're digging in pure cobble or cobble boulder mix, like up in Prince William Sound, Alaska, that can be really tricky. So how far do I dig down? Well, in this particular case, I dug down through the granule and sand till I hit a very fine grain material underneath. So now I'm down to that silt mud layer underneath the sand. If I have oil that has penetrated into here, it's very unlikely to penetrate into that very fine layer. So that would be sufficient. If I hit groundwater, I would probably stop digging there, simply because as I dig further, it's just flooding the pit. But now that I have a pit, I want to document the conditions. So amongst other things, we want to document how deep it is.
And this is another job for the assistant. So just a little under 20 centimeters to the bottom of that fine grain layer.
And I get a picture of the pit while I have a scale in there. You'll probably also notice that I'm taking the picture with the sun shining on the pit wall, not the other way, and not in the shadow. So I get a good view of what I have on that pit wall. Now, if I had any oil in here, what I would have to document then is how much clean sediment I have above that oil layer. We have a little bit darker layer. I don't, if we can get the camera in close, you'll see that we have a little bit darker layer down here. So you see the pit is 20 centimeters deep, and you see from about 5 centimeters to 10 centimeters, or 10 centimeters down from our surface, we have a darker layer. So we could call that our oiled layer. So we've got 10 centimeters of clean cover, and then we have a 5 centimeter band of oil, and then we have the fine grain material underneath it. So that's how I'm going to characterize and document the conditions of that pit. The other thing I'm going to document in the pit, of course, is I'm waypointing it. So I've got the exact location for it. I already took a picture, and that's waypointed, or that's already GPSed. But that's just to provide some redundancy. And then I want to make sure I describe the character of that oil. Is it oozing out of the pores? Is it thick and continuous, but not oozing? or is it just barely covering the grains? Again, you can refer to the way that we describe that subsurface oiling in your notebook. That's going to give you a clue to whether you have oil-filled pores or partially filled pores, oil residue. And then we'd like to document too if you see it all the way around the pit. In other words, it's a layer under here that's continuous, or if we just hit the edge of something and it seems to be only partial on that wall. And that's what we're going to be documenting for each of these pits. We do want to go, and if we find oil, we want to make sure we dig pits up higher on the shoreline towards the supertidal and into the mid-intertidal to make sure that we have identified if this subsurface oil continues despite the fact that we don't see any surface oil. So I've got that zone identified, I've characterized it, I've characterized that it's clean below. If I happen to have water in the pit, groundwater, I would also note the sheen, the color of the sheen that I see on that water. And then I've completed my work here, except backfilling the pit. Don't leave your pits open. All right. Job done.